Take it away, Gladys.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. We have two amazing speakers today, and the first one is Jackie Huband. She's a computational research support specialist at the University of Virginia. Yes, she is my coworker, and I love her. So her primary role is actually a facilitator. She works as a facilitator to support researchers who are transitioning their code from the HPC platform to the HPC platform. So anything that you have working in your laptop, she can help you to move to the HPC. And she is also active in developing workshops for programmers at all different levels. In addition to her work at the UVA, Jackie has also been an associate professor in computer science and a programmer in the industry. She also has experience in programming with R, Python, MATLAB, C++, and Fortran. And with that, Jackie, the audience is yours.
Thank you. Okay, it'll just take me a minute to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about some lessons that I've learned from teaching Python to humanists. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how I got into this and then what I did and what I've learned from it. So in terms of background, in October 2019, I was approached about teaching a Python workshop to researchers in the humanities. Basically, I was told they had some digital humanities students who needed to learn Intro to Python, that they were going to be taking an exploratory text analytics class, but because they had no programming background, they needed to have some Intro to Python before going into that course. So I was asked, would I be willing to lead a workshop? And I, without doubt, said, yes, of course. And then they said, oh, and here are some suggestions of what we'd like you to do. We'd like it to be a 4-session workshop series before the spring semester. So at first they said 2 sessions in December, 2 sessions in January. And I should include topics like basics of Python, string processing, list processing, regular expressions. And then they added some of the other things like exposure to modules such as NLTK, GenSim, Spacey, Scikit-learn, NumPy, Pandas, and linear algebra. And this is when I said, wait a minute, what are we trying to do here? Because my background is math, and I could spend a whole semester talking about linear algebra. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to fit that into an Intro to Python course. So I started reading a lot of stuff about what humanists need, what are some of the skills that they need, and I put together a plan. So this is what I tried the first time. So I did teach this workshop 3 times. So in my first attempt, I started out, the green is kind of the first day, and we did really well on the first day. I did have them install Anaconda or Python on their laptops as a pre-meeting assignment. I had some intro to programming slides already. So I talked about variables, assignment statements, writing to the console, reading from the console, reading from files, outputting stuff, text as strings. That day went really well. So then the next couple of days, I started getting into what I consider the meat of programming, the controls, like Boolean expressions, if statements, for loops, while loops. I started losing them. So the green here, things went well. They understood what I was talking about. The yellow, they started getting lost. The orange, they were totally lost by the time I got to some of those topics. And you have to understand too, this was just 4 days of workshops where I was trying to cover all of these topics. And I did throw in regular expressions at the end. I took what they had given me as suggestions and I said, well, I need to focus on Python. So I approached this as, this is how I would teach Python to someone. And just as a sample activity, I did try to kind of tailor it to text manipulations. So one of the things I had them do as a small activity was to write a program that would read in. I had an excerpt from Jane Austen's Emma. It was just a paragraph of that. And I wanted them to print the number of times the substring her occurs in the text. And then I asked them to print out the text itself, since it was just one paragraph, and compare what they got for their result versus what they would eyeball and get. And it turns out that the answer that they got there was 8. And it turns out that because of the way it's looking for a substring, it was finding things like mother and father. It was counting every substring. So I kind of spent time with them talking about, well, what is it that when we use this method, count, what is that it's doing? Why is it doing this? Why are we getting these results? And we also looked at, well, is it also capturing her with the capital H, which it wasn't. So we spent a lot of time talking about this, and they seemed to really enjoy that. But again, once I left the topics like this and started going into more of the control structures, they didn't seem to like that as well. The other thing I found was there were things they wanted to learn more about, like how to print in italics to the console, which as a mathematician, I had never thought about doing that. They also want to know how to read other text formats like PDF files or XML files. So I found what I was doing was during breaks, I was going to Google and searching for these things and finding how to do some of this stuff if I didn't already know how to do it. And again, after the first day, the students seemed to be pretty much lost. I think they were just polite sitting through the functions and modules section. I think I totally lost them. I had actually intended to have them do some sentiment analysis using our cluster. We didn't even get to that, but they did like regular expressions, which I found to be odd. And oh, by the way, just in case you're wondering if you want to write something in italics to the console, there's an escape sequence that you can use before the word and then another one after the word. And this was also a learning experience for me because I looked at this and I thought, oh, they're going to not accept this as an escape sequence. It's just going to blow their minds. But they were okay with it. It did what they needed it to do, and they were happy with that. It didn't come up of why does this work? So I thought that was kind of an interesting experience to see that or hear that. So I took a lot of these little things that I learned and I tweaked the workshop. I was asked to offer it again in January 2001. And I again started with having them install Anaconda. I did the intro to programming where I talked about variables, but then I immediately went into text files, reading text files, and I talked about text as strings. Then I started into text processing, like the natural language toolkit and stop words, and creating their own list of stop words. And then simple things like prompting the user for input and writing output, formatting output. Then I used what I had taught with the text manipulation to say, okay, there are things that we can do with text or with strings. We've got other data types. We've got lists, sets, dictionaries, tuples. So I kind of branched off of strings into some of those. And then of course I added the conditional statements, relational operators, loops, all of that stuff. And then I tried to go a little more into some of the processing that they would do on our cluster, where I did give them an introduction to Ravenna is our cluster. I gave them an introduction to that. I showed them how to start a Jupyter lab session on there and how to run a notebook. And again, I talked about regular expressions. But once again, some of these topics, even though I tried to tailor them more to some of their interests, I found that they were struggling with them. So as an example, what I was trying to do was get a little more into what would be appropriate for them. How can I build on their knowledge? So with one of the activities, instead of having them use count to count the substrings in a text, I introduced them to the NLTK package where we could divide the text into the individual words, and we could look at the frequency of the different words and then print out the frequency of specific words. And I found that even though I thought they were going to be terrorized by some of these things, like tokenizing the string, they liked it. They liked these activities because they could see how they could apply it in their own research. And they liked having this NLTK module that they could use and learn more about. So I found that they were more engaged with the topics on the first 2 days. I also found that if I introduced topics as needed, like list comprehensions or for loops, when they needed them, it didn't seem like as scary a topic to them as if I had it as a standalone topic. I also, in the second set of workshops, found that some students started having problems installing Anaconda, the Anaconda distribution of Python, on their laptops. They were totally lost, of course, without the ability to try different things, try the different activities. So I kind of took all of that into consideration, and in my third, and so far it's been my final attempt here, I again tweaked things. I kept a lot of the first day stuff the same, where I started out similarly with intro to programming, exploring text. I also added a visualizing text component because I found that they were lacking we didn't go over visualizing text previously, and they really liked some of these topics. I also got them started immediately on our cluster instead of having them install Anaconda on their laptops. And that was an interesting experience there. And I continued with the stop words. I added stemming and lemmatizing to the topics. And these are all things that, as I learned more and more about what their needs were for text manipulation, I learned more and more topics that I could add to the overall workshop. I kept regular expressions in, but I also included the Leighton-Dirichlet topic modeling. I again tried to introduce functions. I talked about pandas and sentiment analysis. And a lot of these topics, later topics, were things where they really needed to use the cluster to get some good results. What I found here is they didn't seem to be as terrified of the topics because I incorporated more of the text analysis and what they would be needing the cluster for, or Python for, rather than just saying, okay, here are control statements. Here's an if statement, for loop. So an example activity I had here was looking at paired words. So we used part of the NLTK module where we looked for bigrams, and we basically break things down, and then we say, okay, find the pairs of words. What pairs of words occur most frequently? And again, initially I thought they would be frightened by all of these terms and all of the parentheses and dots and things like that. But again, they were getting results that they could understand. So they didn't mind that these were scary words in here. They liked it. I also showed them, and I think I say it up here, that you might not understand everything this is going through or what it's doing, but we will talk about it later. So in this example, I showed, these are some of the, and this got cut off. It actually shows 25 pairs, but I did show them, here are some of the most commonly paired words, like Miss Taylor, Mr. Knightley. But we also found that it included punctuation, because when we tokenized with the particular tokenizer that we used in this case, it kept punctuation as a separate entity. So we had opportunities to talk about that and explore that a little more. So again, I was a little surprised that they were okay with the unfamiliar syntax, seeing for loops or slicing before we discussed the topic. And it turns out I actually spent less time focusing on the Python syntax because they had already seen a for loop in this previous example. Then when they learn what's the syntax for a for loop, why it works, we would go back and say, and we've seen this before. We saw how it worked. Now let's understand why it did that. And they seemed to accept it a little better. The other thing I found was putting them on the cluster instead of having them install Anaconda on their laptops was just as difficult. I mean, both of them are equally difficult. One of the things I did was I offered 2 pre-workshop sessions for people to sit down and learn about the cluster, learn how to log on to the cluster, learn how to use Jupyter Notebooks on the cluster. But not everyone attended those because they were not officially part of the workshop. So again, on the first day, I had to go over a lot of that information again. So that's kind of, I'm still dealing with that and trying to figure out how to go from there. But overall, if I look back at what I've learned from this, one of the things I can say is it helps to spend time talking with the researchers to learn what they want to get from the workshop. For example, the bigrams. I would not have thought of looking at paired words if I didn't know that that was something that they were interested in. And in fact, I was able to help a researcher who works with Tibetan text because he said that they don't have words. They have basically lots of syllables. And the way the syllables are grouped will define the meaning of the sentences. So we use the bigrams to find how are these syllables put together? What are the common syllables? And the researcher was actually, I did get an email from him after the workshop series where he said, it works. This is amazing. And of course, that's what we always want to hear from these workshops. The other thing I would say is start with what the student knows. In this case, it was text, because humanists, from my perspective, the humanists deal a lot with text. So I wanted to start with that and build on that topic. The other thing I found is you do get people with all different levels of knowledge with programming. So always have reference materials available with more detailed explanations of what you're covering. So if someone already knows what you're dealing with or they want to get into it a little deeper, you can have that to easily hand out. Also, don't be afraid to introduce difficult topics. I thought sentiment analysis would blow them away, but they liked it. Also make sure that you share limitations of the software. Things like looking at count and seeing that count was finding substrings and not necessarily finding words. We were also able to use that to launch into regular expressions to talk about why we would want regular expressions. And then finally, I would say be open to new ideas and challenges. When I started the workshop, I was kind of focused on, I'm teaching Python. But once I broadened my scope to, I'm teaching Python to people who deal with text. So let's look at text and see what can Python do with text. I think that helped not only the students in the workshop, but it helped me to understand how to present the material a little bit better. So as a final comment, I still see this workshop as a work in progress. I still see that there are things I can tweak. I can still find areas where I need to improve the activities or the notes that I give out. But I wanted to say, if you all have suggestions or if there are any potential collaborations for this work, they would be greatly appreciated. And I've included my contact information there so that if you do want to get in touch with me, feel free to do so. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gladys now.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you
Jackie.
so much, Jackie. That was amazing. We have a couple questions, right, Christina, but we're going to leave those to the end.
Yeah, so we'll maybe take one question while Francis is getting his slides up, but just for everybody, if you can put your questions in the chat, we'll try to collect them in the doc. And then Jackie, if you want to take a look over the next 15 minutes, that'd be great. I was trying to find if there was like a short one. Francis, go ahead and see if you can get your slides up, or let us know if we should be putting them up for you.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I did see one question. Do I have any statistics on how many people actually used what I showed them? And just based on emails that I got back from people, I'd say about 50% of the students actually used it. And the third time I taught the workshop, I did have some faculty attend it, and they have since talked to me about using some of my notes in their classes so that they're sharing the knowledge with other students. So I'm actually more excited about that than some of the other researchers who are using what I showed them.
Yeah, that's super exciting. All right, Gladys, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. So our next speaker is Francis Steen. He's an associate professor from communication studies at UCLA. He's also the director of the New Escape Television News Archive and the co-director of Red Hen Lab. Also is the part of the international consortium of multimodal communication researchers. And today he's going to speak to us about the opportunities for fruitful and fundable collaborations between humanists, social scientists, and computer scientists. With that, Francis, all yours.
I think you're still muted, Francis.
Thank you. I'm trying to do something that someone probably has a much better answer to. I'm just trying to see all of you at the same time as I'm having a full screen screen share. And maybe you can chat if you have a better solution. So I'm using Keynote. So for humanists and social scientists, computers are attractive for a range of reasons, many of which you will be familiar with. For data acquisition, we can now get, communication, right? So we're interested in human communication. We can gather lots of data now from the internet, and managing that data, sorting it, keeping it stored, making it searchable. These are key concerns. This also opens up opportunities for I'm not sure what Paul is saying here. We're seeing the sunscreen. Is the display working, or what?
Yep,
maybe
we can see your slides.
We see your slides. It's just not the full screen. We're getting the boundaries anyway. So
yeah, okay. So by putting, one of the difficulties in the humanities is humanists tend to work alone and do very detailed work in data sets that individual professor collects, and computing potentially allows large-scale collaboration. And this collaboration extends, the possibilities extend beyond the humanities into computer science, into statistics, and this can significantly open up new sources of funding. And so I'll tell a little bit of a story of what we've gone through here at UCLA in the Department of Communication, which is actually in the social sciences, but it's a kind of spanning. I'm also part of the digital humanities team here at UCLA. And I would argue there's opportunities for collaboration for funding, but also for very fruitful practical and theoretical development. One second, I have this hokey way to proceed. So the data set that we're talking about is a collection of television news stories going all the way back to the Watergate hearings. This was collected by a senior colleague of mine and just existed on a massive number of tapes. And we have permission to keep these both in analog and digital format through a provision in the Copyright Act. You may be familiar with that's sometimes called the Vanderbilt clause. Vanderbilt University had an early television news archive. And so we make use of this and store massive amounts of data, communication data. Now, this project is massive, and before we computerized it, it was extremely difficult for researchers to actually use it. If you give a tape to a researcher, you risk that it's ruined. And so we started capturing directly to disk. And I was interested in Linux, coming in as a fresh assistant professor at UCLA, and was just playing with it. And I just wanted to show my colleagues that this was like a proof of concept. And they said, well, we love it. We hand the whole thing over to you. And then we switched basically from from taping to automated capture, just using, and I just scripted this with bash scripts to just automate. I learned one thing at a time. And we have a system that's basically been now running for like 15 years. It's automating automatic data capture of by now several billion words. Maybe just switch out of this mode and make it a little easier for myself. So it's a data set that is potentially interesting for large numbers of users in media history, in geography, records of forest fires, in health, records of epidemic health information and food advertising and so on and so forth. And it's interesting for people like linguists who look at language. And the particular area that I started working with was people interested in multimodal communication. So gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, this sort of thing, gaze direction. And we started collaborating with people in a bunch of different countries. So we started recording, with the internet. You can suddenly we actually used little Raspberry Pis and an HD home run, tiny LAN devices that would pick up the local television signal, and collected this information from Brazil, from China, from Russia for a while, as long as they dared, and a bunch of other countries. And this was digitized, born digital, right? We didn't need to deal with tapes anymore. Through the system, we were able to do a very consistent recording, to do quality assurance, and to build a search engine that would give us access, and also to use thumbnails and give us visual access to the collection. So this is the kind of project that we've been doing. And it was very difficult to get funding for it. So in those early years, the idea that you would fund, the collection of news, this was, it had never attracted any funding other than some small amounts from the provost at UCLA. And it occurred to me that here's an opportunity for bringing in computer science and fundable projects that would deal with this data on a large scale. Computer science has become much more interested in human communication with the advent of basically AI-driven advertising. So, this is basically the transformation of advertising initiated by Google, where, Google's early, if you remember those happy days, Google had the motto, "Don't do evil," and kind of backed off of all the sort of aggressive advertising that was dominating the internet at the time. And instead said, look, we're going to leave you alone. They gave you a search page that had, only the search field, right? Most valuable page on the internet had nothing on it. And of course, how they monetized this was they gathered information about you, and they could do targeted advertising, which had been, the golden dream of advertising for decades. People had realized that targeted advertising would be extremely effective, but had never had a way to really accomplish it. Google did it. And then of course, Facebook, they now dominate the online advertising industry. So because of that, they have massive amounts of money, way more even than the new initiatives that the NSF is funding in AI, massive amounts of funding to solve these problems, but they deal with human communication. So there's lots of opportunities for employment for people who have background in these issues. As you know, you start out with 6-figure salaries with these people, and understanding human communication has become a hot topic. So in 2008, I connected with IDRI, the Institute for Digital Research and Education at UCLA, kind of coordinating organization within UCLA that connects different groups together with computational resources. And IDRI also runs the Hoffman 2 high performance computing cluster, which we started using sometime in 2009 or 2010, somewhere around there. It's been extremely helpful for us, invaluable. And they directed me to, I explained to them what I was interested in doing, and they directed me to some candidates. And I met with Songchun Zhu, who at the time was a professor of statistics, and he's still there, but he's on leave at the moment as the head of a new inter-university initiative in general artificial intelligence centered at Peking University. So I proposed collaboration with him on massive data mining into visuals in the news, people, events, places. And he said, yeah, he thought this was something that was kind of crazy enough, ambitious enough for the NSF to fund. And we started having a series of this kind of interdisciplinary dialogues, collaborate. I mean, we just met and tried to hammer out, like, what is it we do? And it was extremely illuminating because different disciplines have very different strengths, as I'm sure you guys are perfectly aware of. In the humanities and social sciences, human communication is often described in terms of power struggle, in terms of bias, in terms of influence, propaganda. These are all common terms. It turned out that in computer vision, these were unknown topics, literally unknown. Close to 100% of the work was being done with surveillance video. It was partly done for DoD, partly done for advertisers, or just for security companies. So you had massive amounts of surveillance video, and the task was, can you identify, this is a car, this is a man, he has a hat on, right? And the most sophisticated work would be things like inferring intent of an action, right? Like this person is, on the way to withdraw money from an ATM. They had simply not heard of the idea that images could be used persuasively. When we talked about the news, the Songchun said, well, the news just tells you what happens. Right? It's extremely naive in his own field. Now, flip side of this is that it was extremely illuminating for him to work with humanists. It was very gratifying. I mean, he had a breakthrough. We gave him readings, right? And he picked up on this completely new perspective on his own field. And just anecdotally, when he was offered this directorship in China, he had a choice between going to Tsinghua, which is like the MIT of China, or to Peking University, which is more like a Harvard, if I can make the comparison, with a strong humanities and social science dimension. And Songchun said, look, it's essential for the development of AI to have, strong showing in the humanities and social sciences. So I'm going to go to Peking University. And I take some credit for that. So this was an eye-opening experience. And similarly for us on the humanities side, we found it very illuminating to begin to discover what is it that is easy to do for computers and what is it that is complicated. And these are often quite counterintuitive, something that humans find very easy. So for instance, if you think of humans find it very easy to pick out certain features from a complex visual scene and to characterize the overall scene. Like if you have a scene of lots of people, or you have an outside scene, you have an indoor scene with a television crew and so on, right? These are trivially easy things for humans to identify and to locate within that, let's say, where someone is making a gesture and who the hand belongs to, right? We all have tacit theories that allow us to do this kind of work extremely rapidly and efficiently. Computers don't. You have to teach them everything. They're extremely stupid. The perspective of working with computer vision experts was actually very illuminating. Even like the very advanced work in statistics is in some ways just the formalization of intuitions of what the visual system does very skillfully. Part of what I've learned from working with, high-level AI is that human intelligence is very sophisticated. Right? We're very far from the singularity, in my view. Now we kept working on this and had 2 failed applications. but learned a lot in the process. And this was like, actually we involved a couple of other campuses. We had, you know, this was early days for video conferencing, and we set that up and made the group work, but we got turned down. Positive reviews, but no. And then I got together with one of the people. You can actually see him here, David De Lima, who's now an assistant professor in education in Minnesota. And next to him is Sungchun Ju. They were both part of this project at the time. And he is now my colleague. Sungchun Ju, Jung Suk Ju is my colleague. We hired him in my department from out of computer science. And here you see Sungchun and myself with the group that we got funded. In the process, we did work, for instance, on visual persuasion you may know this, some of this ICCV, CVPR. These are the major conferences for computer scientists. And we introduced these topics of inferring communicative intent in, there's a little Chinese mistake here in the intents. Chinese are unfamiliar typically with the convention of mass nouns. And I didn't really correct it, but anyway, we did some papers, and let me just end by emphasizing that you guys are in a privileged position for seeing potential link-ups between humanities, social science scholars, on the one hand, who may be interested in the kind of fine-grained manual analysis, and who may have access to data sets, and computer scientists may be able to give them access to much larger data sets or methods of acquisition, and then use tools like deep learning to train classifiers from manually annotated data and work with massive data sets. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Francis. That's super interesting. I got a lot of, takeaways, both what you said about generating these collaborations, but also like the time and the process of making it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. This was something that we found, really a deep educational process that I think was very illuminating for both sides.
Yeah, that's great. So we have just a very little time for questions. Jackie, have you had a chance to look through the questions in the Google Doc? Is there anything you want to highlight or talk a bit more about in the next minute?
I've just started looking at the questions in the Google Doc because I was answering some of the questions that were in chat.
Okay, we'll give you a minute. Francis, I had a quick question for you. What did access to a cluster, so you mentioned that has been very helpful. What has that enabled you to do that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
We would have stopped the project without it. We couldn't have continued. It's basically, we use tens of thousands of cycle hours every month, and I just couldn't maintain the machines. The alternative is my department has no skills in that area. Right. And if we had to maintain the machines, if I had to do it, right, I would not have. Right, so it's basically saved the project.
Yeah, so like the amount of data and the processing that had to happen, you needed that scale of computing. Okay. Yeah. Great, thank you. Jackie, any highlights you want to touch on?
Well, I did see one question here about what do I do with students who fall behind? Do I work with them individually? Do I just let them fall behind? What's my priority? One of the things I found that I was doing was slowing down my workshop, because this is actually one thing I can't remember if it was software carpentries that I learned this, but I've heard that if you slow things down, it's better to have people saying, yeah, I knew that, rather than I was totally lost. So I did tend to slow down if people got lost, but I tried to have some additional activities for those who weren't lost so they could keep working and learning more. I wasn't holding them back.
Bob, is your question for Francis or Jackie or both?
Actually, it's for Francis, because I was thinking about, like, this is an incredible journey that he talked about, and certainly it sounds like there were a number of frustrations or friction points along the way. And so, if there were a couple of things that he could have done differently, in hindsight, what that might be.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I actually think the main area where we could have done better is we could have lobbied our deans more effectively to provide higher level university support. And this, now data science is like this huge topic. We were doing data science 10 years ago. And we didn't manage to get UCLA to move on that topic. And I think we might have been able to if we'd been a little more clear-sighted about the future importance of it. And that would have made a big difference for us.
Great, thank you.
Great. Jackie, any final comments from you based on questions you see?
The only other thing is, did I have a TA? And yes, I did. I actually had someone from the humanities to help, but he had some programming experience previously. And that, I think, was a tremendous help for the whole workshop because he could understand their questions sometimes better than I could. So he was able to step in sometimes and translate for me. So that was also very beneficial.
All right, great. Well, thank you both, Jackie and Francis. This was super illuminating, both of your perspectives and your experiences in this field. And I'll turn things over to Jana to wrap us up.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you haven't signed in, please do so now. The link's in the chat. I also want to raise again the fall topics survey. So today's presentation was on a topic that was highly upvoted in that survey. So we definitely pay attention and we're interested in hearing more about what you'd like to have these conversations about. Just a reminder, this call was recorded and that recording will be up. We'll be sending out the link shortly. Today's topic was bridging the gap, reaching underrepresented research domains for large-scale computing. And just one more special thanks to our presenters from the University of Virginia. We had Jackie Huband, and from UCLA, we had Francis Steen. So thanks again so much for joining us. Our next call will be on October 14th. We are kind of in talks to figure out exactly what that's going to be, but it looks like it'll be in conjunction with the data facing track. And I just want to thank everybody who worked on the call. So that would be Justin and Gladys and Christina, Wirawan, Martin, Annalie, Amy, Katya, Bob, and I'm Jana Nugent. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Great call.
Thank you.